So you have decided to learn how to mix metal. Congratulations! Mixing metal will give you so much joy while simultaneously crushing your last sliver of self-confidence and make you want to pull out your hair. Why do you think me and so many great metal mixing engineers are bald? Do you still want to continue? Alright, then let me bid you welcome to the ultimate guide for beginners for mixing metal. In this video, I will go over the 3 cornerstones for metal mixing: equalization, compression, and saturation. If you master these 3 techniques, you will be able to achieve punchy, clear, and massive sounding metal mixes. In the first part of the video, I will thoroughly go over what each of these techniques does to your sound and how to use them. I will then mix a track from scratch using only these 3 techniques to show you what results you can expect. To keep this as beginner-friendly as possible, I'm going to use only stock plugins from Cubase, Slate Digital plugins, and a few from Neural DSP. The template that I'm finishing today, I'm also going to make available for all of my backers on Patreon, so if you are interested, consider going over there. No matter what DAW or what plugins you use, the principles that I'm going to teach you will be universally applicable and will be usable no matter the tools you're using. I will have chapter markers below, so feel free to jump to a certain section if you're looking for something specific. For each of these cornerstone techniques, I'm going to talk about controls, what parameters you can change about them, tone, how the technique alters the sound, and problem solving, which is what issues it's solving in a metal context. With all that out of the way, let's jump into the first technique, which is equalization, or just EQ for short. If I want to open up the EQ panel in Cubase, I'm just pressing this button here, Edit Channel Settings, and this window is coming up. I'm gonna use the drum part here for demonstrating what the EQ is doing. So I'm just gonna press here, and it's gonna create a EQ point, a band that is now boosting by around 8 decibels at 250 hertz or so. I'm gonna slide the band around the frequency range so you can have a listen to what exactly it's doing to the sound. So I am adding information, I am boosting at certain points of the frequency spectrum, which can be useful, which I'm going to go over a bit later. I can also do cuts, so that means removing information. The next control I want to go over is the Q setting, and what this is doing is that if I'm increasing it, it's gonna make the cut more narrow. So that means I can make more precise alterations to the sound. Or I can make it wider by decreasing the Q value. So the bell here is a bit wider. Apart from these controls, you also have different shapes to play with. So this is the standard shape, which is called a bell shape because it looks a bit like a bell. This is the most common shape of an EQ. You can also play with what is called a shelf. So this is what is called a low shelf, which is boosting low frequencies under 112 hertz here in a shelf shape. So it's boosting everything above or below a certain point, and you can also change the Q settings to make it a bit more narrow and a bit like this, or make it more smooth. Another really common EQ shape is the cut or the pass. So this is what is called a high pass because it's letting higher frequencies pass through. It's a bit unpedagogical. You can also call it a low cut. So that means it's cutting everything below 157 hertz here. And of course, you also have a low pass or high cut, how you wanna call it. So those are the basic controls of equalization. Next, I'm gonna talk to you about the tone aspect of equalization. So that is, what is it doing to the actual sound that you're affecting? The main thing is to make it brighter or darker. So let's say I want some more cymbals in this drum track. Then I might add a band. I can just scroll my wheel to adjust the cue. And now I'm bringing out a bit more sizzle in the high end. Or let's say I want some more kick drum. Or some more snare. This is affecting the tonal characteristic of the sound. And in general, when you want to make something brighter or darker, you're using a wider boost or a wider cut. Because if you make the cue very narrow like this, it's going to sound a bit more unnatural, and it's better for really honing in on problem areas that I'm going to go over very shortly. I'm sure you have heard about digital EQs, such as this one, versus analog EQs. And when you are changing the tonal characteristic of a sound, it's a bit more common to use an analog equalizer. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to use the Virtual Mix Rack by Slate Digital. And analog equalization, it usually has very specific band shapes, so it's imparting a certain sound. In general, if you are boosting, say, 400 hertz, it's not only boosting 400 hertz. There are other more subtle things happening, like cutting above or below the bell, for instance. It can add some pleasant saturation. That is another cornerstone that I will go over later. It's generally imparting a certain tone to the sound. This is really traditional SSL equalizer. Let's say I wanted to add some brightness to these drums. You can see I'm boosting 15 decibels, but still it's sounding quite pleasant, I would say. Maybe some low end. And here you have a high pass or low cut. But the general principles are the same. I still have a Q control here. So let's say I'm boosting here at 3000 hertz. I can make the Q more narrow or more wide. So the principles are exactly the same. The main reason to use an analog equalizer is if you enjoy the particular tone that that equalizer have. So for more tone shaping things, I like to use more analog style equalizers. Next, we're going into problem solving. So what issues can EQ solve in a metal context? For this, it's generally a good idea to use a digital EQ because you usually get a visual representation of the spectrum, which can be really helpful. And also you have much more control and you can really see what you're affecting. So a really good example of this is when you need to notch. And notching is removing certain problem areas, like a resonance in the cymbal that sounds really harsh, for instance. Then you can do a notch, which is a very narrow Q EQ cut. So I'm gonna show you what I mean. Starting with adding a bell, making the Q very narrow. listening for problem areas by just sweeping it up here. So here is an area that's not sounding too nice, so the next step is to cut it. Another use for this is to fit the instrument into the mix. This is something that I will demonstrate later when I'm actually mixing the song, but it's essentially carving out space for different instruments and making sure that they don't clash too much. Some clashing is actually needed in metal to get this glued and really heavy sound. You cannot have 100% separation between the instruments in metal because it will sound really weird. Also, when you have rhythm guitars that are literally taking up everything from 70 hertz up to like 12,000 hertz, and you have the drums that are from 40 hertz up to 20,000 hertz, it's impossible to not get some overlap. It's finding this balance, the correct amount of overlap, that will make your mixes sound great. Next, we are moving on to compression, which actually is one of the most important techniques that I'm going over today, and also one that I personally thought was really difficult to understand in the beginning. So I'm gonna try my best to explain this in as pedagogical of a manner as I possibly can. So starting off with the controls of the compressor, we're starting with the threshold, which is the easiest to understand, I would say. A threshold is essentially a line that is now set to minus 20 decibels. Every sound that is passing through the compressor that is exceeding minus 20 decibels in volume is going to be affected by the compressor. And what a compressor does is that it's essentially compressing the sound, so it's turning the volume down. To illustrate this, I'm going to just go into some automation here. Let's say I have a compressor for this rhythm guitar DI. So if this rhythm guitar is exceeding the threshold set on the compressor, the volume will be turned down. But as you can see, the sound is pretty dynamic here. So it's starting a bit louder and then it's getting more quiet. So the amount that it's turned down is decreasing because it's not exceeding the threshold. Then here we have another blip. So then the compressor will turn it down again. And you see it's quite loud here, but here it's getting more quiet again, so it's going back, right? And what this is doing is that it's making the volume of the sound more even, and a more even sound will be easier to hear in a full metal mix. So this is the foundational principle of why compression is so useful, is that it's bringing forward the more quiet parts of a sound. And like I said, especially in the metal context, this is super crucial to have things be audible. Next, we are going over what is called ratio. And I'm going to simplify it a little bit for this video, but essentially, if you have a higher ratio, it's going to turn down the volume more than if you have a lower ratio. So let's say that this is with a ratio of 2:1. I'm going to increase it to, let's say, 6:1. What that will do is that it's going to increase the amount that the sound is turned down, that is exceeding the threshold. With some compressors, you can go all the way up to infinity here on the ratio. If you have infinity to 1, then it's essentially a brick wall limiter. And that is just everything that is going over the threshold is being flattened. So it's exactly the same volume. Next, we have the attack. So the attack is how long it takes for the compressor to engage. So this would be a very, very fast attack because it's engaging exactly where the guitar is hitting. If we had a bit of a slower attack, it would then take a little bit of time. Of course, in the reality, it might look something like this, but just for the sake of being clear, we have had it like this. So it's letting a little bit of the initial hit through, and this can be useful by increasing the attack part of a sound. So let's say I have a snare drum. It's very important for that to be quite high in attack to poke through the mix. So if I'm compressing a snare drum, I don't want to kill that attack. Then I'm going to increase the attack control on the compressor, so I'm letting more of the snare attack through it. So essentially it's delaying the compression and letting more of the initial part of the sound through. And likewise, if you have a slow attack, it's killing all of the attack in the sound. So this can also be useful in some situations. Say you have staccato strings, then you don't want them to be super pokey because you have so many other attacky things in a metal mix. Then you would like to keep it super level. Then I would have a very short attack. Next, we're going to go over the release control. So this engages when the sound goes below the threshold and it's no longer being affected by the compression. Then it starts to release, and this control will adjust how long this release takes. So let's say this is a 500 millisecond release. If I'm now decreasing it, the release will be faster. So it will make the compression more snappy. Those are the basic controls of a compressor. Now I'm going to show you how it can affect the tone of a sound. As I said before, it will make the sound more even in general, which will make it more audible. I'm going to demonstrate here with this drum track. You can hear that it's clamping down, that the snare and the kick are not poking out as much, and in extension you can then hear the cymbals a bit more. The next use for compression is to increase or decrease the punch of something. So here we had a really fast attack, which is then killing all of the punch of the drums. If I want some more attack with this compression, I'm going to increase this value. So I'm gonna just exaggerate it first and you will hear the difference. So you can hear that it's letting the kick and the snare through a lot more, right? And then you find the sweet spot. So around 50 milliseconds or so, I think it sounds quite punchy and quite good. Just have a listen. So you can hear that it's letting through some attack, but it's still clamping down, so you're getting the best of both worlds. And this actually is increasing the amount of punch that you can get from something. This effect is also known as pumping the compressor. So when you get this effect that is going up and down a lot, that is called pumping. And it's an effect that you use a lot when mixing metal for getting this super punchy, super in-your-face sound. Problem solving. What problems can this solve? And yeah, that is to make things more or less audible in the mix. So more audible by making the sound more even, less audible by reducing unnecessary spiky information that you don't want in certain instruments. If you have any questions at all, just pop them in the comments below and I will answer everyone. Now we are moving on to the third cornerstone technique of metal mixing, and that is saturation. Now this is tricky stuff if you're a beginner. It's usually quite subtle changes to the sound, but at the same time it's super crucial for getting some vibe into your mix and also gluing everything together. It's filling out your sound a bit more. It's also making it a bit more even, so it's acting kind of like compression. It usually has a smoothing character to your sound, so it's making it a bit more pleasant to listen to. If you have a really harsh sound, some saturation can really help. But let's just have a look here at some saturation that is available in the virtual mix rack. Starting with the controls, We have, firstly, the type of saturation. You have so many different types. Here we have what is known as console saturation. So this is emulating sound being driven through a console. We have tape saturation, which is emulating the sound of recording to tape. We have tube saturation. So you have so many different styles to experiment with. Each one has their own unique flair and their own unique sound, but the principles are still largely the same, I would say. The effect is just more or less subtle. A funny story is actually that when people were recording in an analog studio before, they were doing all that they could to reduce the effects of analog saturation. So reducing noise, reducing the effect of consoles to get as clean of a sound as possible. And then when people started mixing inside of the computer, inside of DAW, the sounds were 100% clean, so no analog interference. And it sounded so sterile and so boring. So that has led to companies making emulations of the analog gear so that we can now introduce saturation in amounts that, we feel is appropriate for a certain mix. Let's just have a listen to what this is doing. So if I'm decreasing the input, it's less saturation. If I'm exaggerating it here, you can hear this effect that it's saturating. It's actually now distorting the sound, so removing spiky attack information. We also have the drive control here. So yeah, pretty subtle stuff, but it's increasing the effect of the saturation. Just have a listen. I'm going to exaggerate it a bit, and I'm going to turn it off and turn it on again. Just listen to that it's adding some information. It's making it sound more full. It's evening it out a little bit. It's making it sound a bit more smooth. I will show you one more style of saturation, which is tape saturation, which is used a lot in metal mixing. It's adding some bass, it's making the high end very smooth, it's yelling together and just making it sound full and a bit more alive. So essentially you can think of saturation as EQ and compression that are reacting dynamically to what is being inputted into the plugin. But speaking of tone, what tone can saturation impart on a certain sound? Well, it can make it more or less punchy depending on what saturation style you're using. It can have an effect to gel together instruments in a mix. So say you are using the same saturation style for the drums, for the bass and the guitars, then it has a tendency to boost similar frequencies and also make it gel then a bit more to each other. It can also increase the vibe or like the alive feeling of your mix, while at the same time then decreasing the definition. So it's like decreasing the separation between the instruments. So like with everything in life, a balance is what you need to find. Which amount of separation and definition do you want in this particular style of mixing versus how much analog feel do you want? How much vibe do you want? If you have zero saturation on your mix, you're gonna get amazing definition, amazing separation, but it's going to sound super boring and super sterile. In general, the vibe of a certain analog equalizer or compressor is coming from the saturation style that it's imparting on the sound. So that's also something to consider. If you're using an emulation of an analog equalizer, you are adding saturation in one form or another. And also problem solving, it's melding together a little bit here, but it smoothens out the sound as I've already been through before. And it can also bring down overbearing transients, which is the attack part of a sound. So say a snare drum is too pokey, saturation will mellow it out. I'm going to show you here using tape saturation. I'm going to play you first without it, and then I'm engaging it, and just listen to the snare drum, how much it's poking through, how much attack the drums have. So here I exaggerated the effect, but you can hear how the snare drum is being pressed down like from a compressor. But the difference from a compressor is that it's also then adding harmonic information, so essentially like an equalizer, depending on how hard you push it into the saturation. So you can think of it as similar to the threshold of a compressor, that the harder you push into it, the bigger effect you're going to get. All right, let's move into mixing this track. As I said before, I'm going to use exclusively these three techniques: equalization, compression, and saturation to mix this song. Firstly, it's a good idea to think about which style you're going for with the mix before starting anything. So for this particular track, I'm going for quite a heavy sound with a lot of vibe, a lot of saturation. So I'm not considering definition as much. Of course, I want definition in my track, but it's not the priority. The priority is to get a really heavy and meaty sound out of this mix. I'm going to first go over what I'm using for each of these sounds. So a good idea when beginning mixing is to use mix-ready drums. So here I'm using One Kit Wonder Metal by GGD Drums, and it's sounding great straight out of the box. The whole point of these One Kit Wonder kits is to have a mix-ready tone, so we can just pop it into the mix and it will sound great immediately. And why this is good when you are just starting out is because this gives you a framework for the mix. So you have a well-balanced drum kit already. A drum kit encompasses everything from 40 Hz up to 20,000 Hz. So all of the audible frequency range that you're going to have in a metal mix. So if you have a really well-balanced drum kit, you can then use this as a framework for the rest of the instruments. Next, for the bass, I'm using the finished mix tone of Djembass 2, just this dist tone here. Another tip, use one of these MIDI basses when starting out and learning mixes. If you're interested in picking up Djembass 2, I have an affiliate link in the description below that gives me a kickback, so it's a great way to get started and also support the channel. Next we have the Hydra, but printed out as a dry input, a DI, and it sounds like this. And this is actually going to be the first thing that I will do. I will do a very basic guitar tone for this DI. And for that, I am using the Gojira from Neural DSP. You can use any amp simulator you want. There are plenty of free options available as well. Okay, that's good enough for now. We also have a radio guitar layer. And for this, I want a radio effect. So I want a really filtered sound. And that's achieved just by copying over the amp sim here. I'm just going to use the EQ in Cubase. I'm going to change this to a high pass. And I'm going to change this one to a low pass. And there we have a radio effect for the guitar. Okay, I would say that's all of the raw sounds ready for starting mixing. And the first step that I'm always doing is that I'm creating a so-called bus. And what is a bus? That's a very important concept when mixing. And it's essentially when you are feeding certain tracks into an auxiliary track. So I am now feeding the drums, the bass, and the rhythm guitar into a single grouped bus. So essentially what I am then doing on the bus channel is going to affect all of them together. So in Cubase you do it like this. I press the drums, I hold shift, and I press the rhythm guitar, so this is selecting all of the free tracks. I am right-clicking down here, add group channel. Okay. I'm going to call this the instrumental bus. And it's going to the stereo out, which is perfectly fine. Add a track. All right, let's listen to what we have going on here on the instrumental bus. And the first step that is super important is to add some saturation. So I'm going to do this using the virtual mix rack just as before. When doing saturation on a bus like this, I like doing console emulation. So I'm going to use a model here. I'm going to increase the drive to have a bit of a more exaggerated effect. And then I'm going to tweak this so I'm going about into the red around the 0 mark. The next step is to do some compression on the bus. This is super integral to the sound of any metal mix, and this is what is called bus compression, essentially compression on a bus. Here I'm going to use the FG Gray from Slate Digital. These settings are used by pretty much everyone that I know that are good metal mixers. And what I'm doing here is that I'm mainly compressing the snare drum. I'm looking for around 3 decibels of gain reduction on this meter on the snare drum, and this will make it sound much more glued and much more cohesive immediately. So adjusting the threshold. So just listen here to the difference. Especially listen to the snare drum. It's just sounding so much more punchy and so much more glued into the rest of the mix. When I remove this, the snare drum just pokes out too much. Super important for a good sounding mix. Next, we are moving to the stereo out bus, and this is what everything is fed into, essentially what is known as the master out bus. And I have already put on a plugin here, which is acting as a maximizer. So what is a maximizer? It's essentially shaving off the peaks of your mix and making it much more loud. It's acting as a limiter mostly. I'm going to just use this FGX also by Slate Digital. So if you have the All Access Pass by Slate Digital, I'm not sponsored by them, but it's a great investment if you're starting out mixing. You get so much value from this pack, and I'm using their plugins all the time. So you can see it's shaving off some peaks here. For now, that's good enough. I'm also on the stereo out bus going to add some tape saturation. with the virtual tape machine from Slate Digital, and I'm here looking for a little bit below the red. I'm going to feed the rest of the elements into this as well, so let's add those in. So I'm looking for it to go slightly into the red. That's a good starting point. Okay, now we have a pretty cool sounding raw mix, I would say, just from the bus compression and the stereo out processing. Just have a listen if I remove the bus processing now. Now the next step is to go over each instrument. What I like to do is to do them with the drums to get this framework sound, right? So what I usually do when mixing is that I start to get a drum mix going. Here we have this for free. Of course, if you want a bit more of a challenge, try doing a drum mix on your own. I have a great video on that as well that you can check out. But for this purpose, I'm going to use the finished tone of the One Kit Wonder Metal. The only thing that I can hear initially is that I would like a bit more attack on the snare drum, the low end of the snare drum. So you can see here that it's around 200 Hertz. Adding a band, making the Q appropriately wide. It's just hitting a little bit harder, which I like. Next, the bass, starting with EQ as well. To me, it's sounding a little bit too overbearing in the low end, so I'm going to add here a low shelf. Okay, let's have a look at the overall frequency balance tone-wise. So this part is sticking out a bit to me. Next, let's add some compression to this sound. I'm going to use the distressor from the virtual mix rack, and I'm going to give it a slow attack, so a lot of the attack is coming through. I want the initial hit of the bass to really hit you in the face and make it punch really hard. I'm going to also have a fairly fast release, which will make it so that all of the initial hits are affected equally because the compression has time to release before the next one. Here we don't have a threshold control, but instead we have input and output. So you can look at this as if the threshold is set, and if you push it harder, you're going to get more compression because it's going beyond the threshold of the plugin. So I'm looking at around 3 decibels, maybe 2 decibels. And now, because this does not have a automatic gain feature, which is matching the output to the input, you need to do that by ear, and then you're adjusting this output knob here. So let's just have a listen without it first. Now you can listen, it's a bit too quiet, so I'm gonna increase the volume here. It's a really common mistake that if something is louder it always sounds better. So when you are making changes, you need to match the input and output volume so you're not fooled by the loudness. So we can only listen to the effect the compression is having, and it's not just a volume boost. So what I'm hearing is that it's increasing the attack slightly. It's also bringing down the slides, which I felt were poking out too much before. Making it more even, so with the drums. Listen to the slides before the compression. And now with it, it's keeping it much more in line, I would say. Next, I like to do tape saturation on bass because it's just making the low end so fat and nice. So here's a good point to move into something that I haven't talked about yet, which is automation. I'm going to do more automation towards the end of the mix, but here you can listen to these notes, the high notes of the bass are sticking out a lot. So I'm then going to use show automation, and immediately we have the volume automation. Here you can also select a lot of different parameters to automate, but yeah, for now I want to automate the volume, and I'm gonna bring them down slightly. So I'm bringing them down like 2 decibels as compared to... Okay, moving on to the rhythm guitars. Let's start with equalization. I think it's sounding slightly radio-y, so this is like this area. Next, let's just notch out a bit of these annoying parts of the sound. I'm gonna change this one to a bell because I want to remove a little bit of low-end mud. Next, I'm going to add some saturation to the sound, same as for the bass guitar. And I'm also going to copy the same compression settings before the saturation as I had for the bass, just making it slightly more level and increasing the attack. So I'm still not feeling the tone, so I'm going to add some more equalization before the compression here. It's also adding some saturation, so it's going to make it sound more fat. I want to hear a bit more low end, like not the mud that I removed earlier, but around 100 Hertz, so boosting here. I also am hearing something that is sounding a bit harsh, maybe around 3000 Hertz, so let's try removing that. I'm now hearing in the bass a bit of a problem area that I would like to notch out. Okay, let's see which one it is. You can see the frequency graph here. Okay, let's see if we can fit in the other elements now of the mix, starting with this main melody loop. let's start with some EQ. Firstly, I'm seeing a lot of information down here below 100 Hertz. I don't need that in this sound, so I'm going to do a high pass filter and going to filter that stuff out. Okay, then let's just add a boost. That's what I'm usually doing. Slide it around a little bit and see where it's really making the loop pop out of the mix and be really audible. Okay, that's sounding quite good. And then I just want to remove a little bit of this harsh area that is, I think, clashing a little bit with the rhythm guitars. Okay, you know the drill. Let's do some saturation to make it sound a bit more alive. Also, let's do compression. I'm here gonna use a different style of compression. This is known as opto style, which is a compression style with fixed attack and release. It's a very smooth style of compression and it's great for layers like this, great for vocals as well. So let's just solo it and check it out. Okay, so you can hear that it's becoming more even. It's not poking out so much from the mix, and also it's bringing up some of the more quiet elements of this sound, so it's now perfectly audible. Okay, sweet. We also have a percussion layer here. Let's do that together with the drums. Okay, equalization. Also, I'm gonna remove some low end here. I want the drums and bass to be king of the low end, so I'm removing this from this layer. Let's do the same technique, boosting, and see where it sticks out. Okay. It's usually around 1 to 2,000 Hertz in my experience. Adding tape saturation. And also some compression. I'm going to use the opto style, but I'm going to engage the limit function. And what this does is that it's cutting off the peaks super nicely, so it's not sticking out at all and not competing with the snare. Okay, now let's move on to the final part of this mix, which is automation. And what I like to do is to begin by automating the first downbeat of each section on my instrumental bus. So, like here, this is a really big hit. You really want this to have a big impact. What I'm then doing is that I'm adding an automation point at the start. I'm adding another one immediately after, and then I'm doing a boost of like 2.5 decibels maybe. Okay, so it's hitting a bit harder. And you can do this to emphasize hits throughout the mix. So I have one here, I want another one here. And we have another one here. And another one here. I'm then going through the track and see if certain elements stick out too much, or if I want to bring out something maybe. I think the bass can be a slightly lower volume for these high notes even still. Here's actually a good example of how much the tape saturation is doing for the overall sound. You should listen to two things. One is how much fatness is being added when I'm engaging the tape saturation, and also how much glue is added, so how much the instruments meld together. We are losing some separation, as I said before, but we are gaining so much vibe and so much glue. Okay, next I've added some samples just to reinforce certain parts of the song. So you can hear how much impact it's adding to the drop here. Okay, and next some reverse reverb before. Okay, so now what I'm hearing is that I want even more low end for my guitars. So I'm gonna do this with another EQ here. And I just wanna add like 60 Hertz, like really heavy bottom end. Let's also try to add some extra punch to the drums by adding some EQ here for the snare drum, using some analog equalization here at like 2 decibels. I also feel that the snare now in the full context is slightly too blippy, so what I'm going to do is just add some compression to smoothen that out. I'm still gonna keep the attack fairly slow, so some attack of the snare is poking through, but I'm going to compress it a bit to increase the sustain. Okay, let's just have a listen here. Listen to how much more the punch is coming through while also bringing up the quiet layers of the drums. Okay, now we're moving on to the final part of the process, which is just equalization on the master bus. I'm gonna add the mix rack here, and I'm going to use a great EQ for processing the master bus. This is also a great way to introduce some references. I'm using Metric AB for referencing, but you can just load your references straight into the session here. It will work perfectly fine. So let's just compare. So my mix is sounding a bit more muddy to my ears. So let's just have a look what we can do about that. Opening up this one, I am going to find the mud and remove it. Okay, let's compare. I think we also need to remove some 200 Hertz. We also need some more bites, so let's add some 4000 Hertz. and some sizzle at 15k. Okay, let's listen to the changes. It should be quite subtle changes when you're doing alterations to your master, because if you have to do huge changes to the master bus, then there is an issue in the mix that you should fix. So let's just have a listen through the track and see if we want to change anything else, if something is sticking out to us as too loud or too quiet or so. And I will also then export the song. I will export the template so you can mix along with me and make everything available through my Patreon. Okay, so something that I'm noticing here is that I want to bring the volume of the loop down a bit for the first verse. Okay, and also I want to automate the master bus, so I'm making the entire first verse slightly less loud to make it a bit more of a drastic change from the intro riff. Another high bass part here that I want to bring down slightly. Sweet! Thank you so much for following along this ultimate guide for beginner mixing. As I said before, if you have any questions, just ask them below and I will do my best to answer in as clear of a way as possible. All of the raw multitracks, the mixed stems, the full song, and the template for Cubase will be available on my Patreon if you are a backing supporter there. If you want more in-depth and more advanced mixing tutorials, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you're looking to mix drums, then you can check out this video next, and I'll see you there.